So I'll make so. Thanks everybody for coming. Again, we've got a good turnout, and 100 or so people for these sessions, which are every week, and we've been growing. The Net Zero APPG have been growing our audience, so that's great. And it's good that we can stay in touch in this way remotely at this point, and before we'll see you again maybe later in the year or possibly next year in person in the House of Parliament again. This session again is really timely, particularly today. The Prime Minister has announced, I think with 3 different slogans on this agenda. Build, build, build's one that sticks into my mind, but I think the official government one is building back better, but I might be wrong. I didn't quite catch the brief this morning. The Labour Party has also got a consultation which closed today on a green recovery, which is the name of this session. So everybody is focused on this, including, of course, the Committee on Climate Change. And we have Lord Debe to kick us off. And then we have Sir David King, who is useful in 2 ways, because to have a green recovery, we have to recover. And he convened and chairs the Independent Sage Group, but obviously he has been the government's chief scientific advisor and also the climate change advisor between 2013 and 2017. So, you know, I think today we have got absolutely, from a domestic point of view, the 2 most prominent voices, I think, that we could get in this field outside of the government, as they are both, Lord Debe and Sir David, independent voices. So, John, do you want to start us off, and then we can bring people in for questions?
Well, I'm so sorry that I don't know why I've been on it all day, and the video has worked so far. So I just apologise for it not working this moment. Anyway, we presented our report to Parliament, which is the annual report, which we are, of course, as the Climate Change Committee, bound by statute to do before the end of June every year. And normally it is a report which sums up what the government has done, or very often what the government hasn't done in the year to meet its statutory obligations in the end to reach net zero in 2050, but also, of course, to fulfill the 3rd, 4th and 5th carbon budgets. This year we did it differently, partly because it was the first year of the net zero, and partly because we believe that the most important thing for the government to understand is that this is an all government activity and not something that is presided over and limited to BEIS and DEFRA, which it very often appears to be. So we actually talked about the responsibilities of each department in order that we will be able to measure them next year even more specifically and make departments recognise the part that they are playing. And I think today is a good example of that. I mean, you announced that you're going to build a lot more schools and a lot more hospitals. Well, the first thing you have to make sure is that each one of those schools and each one of those hospitals actually are set at 0 emissions. I mean, that is part of the deal that you have to do. And so that's a matter for the Ministry of the Department of Health and for the Department of Education. So before we produced this report, I went around each of the departments talking to their civil servants about what this really would mean. And so we will be pressing the government in detail on those issues. What we said to the government fundamentally was that there is no alternative to growing out of COVID-19, but growing green out of COVID-19, that there isn't a sort of quick fix, dirty way. The only way is to create jobs through doing the things that we have to do anyway, if we're going to meet that even greater danger to the world, which is climate change. And so we started off by writing to the Prime Minister and making that very clear in a letter earlier on in the year. In this report, we have given him and Parliament a very detailed explanation of how you do this. And of course, I will just refer to, so it's much more interesting for people to discuss it, so I'm not going to go on very much longer, but let me first of all say, of course, energy efficiency in homes is absolutely crucial to dealing with climate change, but it's also the quickest and best way of creating jobs, providing the training and reskilling that we need, and doing that all over the country. Prime Minister has yet again today talked about levelling up. Well, if we want to level up, the very best way to level up is to deal with things which we can do all over the country, and actually in which we would be more likely to be helping people in the least advanced parts of the country, the places which have least benefited from the very significant economic growth which we've had over recent years. There is some of the worst housing. There is some of the people who are least able to keep warm in the winter. And therefore, that's exactly what a major program of refurbishment of houses. But we mustn't make the problem worse. There are 1 million houses now that have been built, which will have to be retrofitted because the government did not act to set proper standards for house building. And that is actually one of the biggest and most serious things that we have, is that we are still building crap houses which are not fit for purpose. And because they are not fit for purpose, we're going to have to redo them. We just can't have that 1 million houses grow even more. And so the second part is to make sure that we change the rules to make sure that new homes are fit for purpose. And the third thing that we have to do is obviously to prepare for a carbon-free transport system. And that means bringing the date forward to 2032, when we no longer sell cars except those which are electric. And to do that, we have to set a series of standards between now and then, because it's no good leaving it till then, because all that will happen will be that the industry will wait till the last moment and then say it can't do it. What we need to do is to have a program whereby there is a increasing step, so that every year a higher proportion of the cars sold in Britain have got to be electric. If you do that, then you've also got to make sure that people can use those cars, and that means getting a much better system of charging points. We've got to make it easy for people to have charging points in their homes if their homes are suited for that. The moment there is no one-stop shop that makes that work, a whole series of practical things like that that need to be done. We need also to make sure that our electricity supply system is very much more tuned to the new demands of it. And there are many other things, but I don't want to leave without saying we also have to recognize that we've had a change which has been forced on us by COVID, but it's not a change which started with COVID. It's a change which was starting before, but which the pandemic has made very clearly much faster. And that is the trend to work at home. That is the video conferencing, which with the single exception of today, we can all use very simply. It means that more and more people are going to say to themselves, there is no need for me to fly to this place or that place. I can, in fact, do my job and perhaps go once every 5 times rather than 5 times. I don't need to go into the office every day. I can go in for 2 days a week. This will change the world in real ways, and the government has got to make it easier. And so less money of the roads budget should be spent on roads, and more money on really giving people fast broadband everywhere. We need to maximise the opportunities that people have for working at home if that's what they choose to do. And I want to see the government set an example of that. So far, I think the private industry has done that. And then lastly, just to say to it, I want to make sure that people have greater opportunities to walk and cycle. One of the things that we have learned by experience and not just intellectually is that the air we breathe in our towns is disgraceful, disgusting and damaging. No one who lives in London has failed to recognise what clean air really means. And as we go back, and we appear to be going back to breathe badly again, I think we need to have a real step towards cleaner air, more opportunities to walk, more opportunities to cycle, and this very much faster move towards electrical motor cars. And if we're going to have that, we have to have the investment that we need in the next stage, which is in carbon capture and storage, and particularly in the hydrogen economy. Well, that's enough for me. So I'm very happy to discuss with anyone who wants to.
Oh, thank you, Lord Debe. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into those three areas: housing, transport or electric vehicles, and clean air. And then I'm going to open the floor to the panelists. So clearly, we're in a situation which, obviously CCC has alerted us to. The government's current policies means we won't meet our obligations under Paris, the fourth and fifth carbon budgets, etc. And so in housing, you spoke about, and I'll use your phrase, crap houses. My view is that the way that and I'm not sure if we've got Barrett's on the call today, but the way that we build houses is effectively obsolete now, and that we need to rapidly increase house building via modular, factory built houses, which are, at passive house standard or close to passive house standard. Do you think that, and it was also about incentives. So do you think what government policy, do you agree with that? And what government policies should there be? How should they incentivise or utilise the planning system to accelerate that? Second, on electric cars, similarly, the best-selling car in Norway is the Nissan Leaf, which is made in Sunderland. So the Norwegians, through their policy agenda, are helping us build back better our green recovery by providing jobs in Sunderland. And they've done it through scrapping VAT on electric cars, providing free parking for electric cars. And actually, I'm not sure it's in everywhere in Norway, but certainly in parts of Norway, electric cars can use bus lanes. There's an incentive for motorists to buy them. And that's why the Nissan Leaf's the best-selling car. And I think it's 55% now of all new cars in Norway that are sold are electric. And they might not need a 2032 date because they might well have reached it already through incentives. So do we need similar incentives to Norway rather than staging posts and just hoping the market will provide the results? And finally, on clean air, we've got in place where the air is the worst outside London and in London as well, the proposals around clean air zones, charging clean air zones. Based on the EU figures, 40 ppm. But the way that it's measured and the technicalities means actually there's some room for manoeuvre. So during COVID, obviously, nowhere, I don't think, reached 40 ppm or very few places. And the modelling might be that actually we don't really need the charging zone anymore because we can meet the legal limit. So do you think we need a new legal limit, for instance, the WHO limit? And do you think we need a less technical approach to this? Because it has been very technical based on the legal cases that Client Earth have brought. So there's three there to start us off with.
Well, I'm a practical man, and the first reason, if I go backwards from these, the first reason that we have problems with the clean air zone is that they are not enforced. And the reason that they're not enforced is that in many areas, the police do not have that as a priority. And there's so much for them to do anyway that if it's not a priority, then that doesn't happen. And the fact is that unless you have enforcement so that people know that if they've got a car which doesn't meet the requirements, that they will be likely to be actually fined, then until that happens, people will not take this seriously. So enforcement is very important here. I do think that the fundamental change must be that we want a society where dirty cars become unacceptable. And if there were an area where one needs to look very carefully, it is how we help people who are less well off but who need transport of some kind to be able to get that. Because the real difficulty that we will have if we're not careful is that we will move to an electric vehicle fleet, but a lot of the old cars will be on the road and will be driven by people who cannot afford to do better than that. So the just society is one that really looks at and now starts thinking about what you do about that. Which brings me back to the vehicles themselves. I'm a bit chary of using Norway as an example, because they have a uniquely peculiar situation. They had a very, very high tax on motor cars. And therefore, if you take that tax off for electric cars, the electric cars become so significantly cheaper than the alternative that you'd be pretty bonkers to buy the alternatives. Now, I don't see any British government getting to that stage. I don't think that's what's going to happen. So it seems to me it should be a mixture of encouragement and regulation. And that's why I want to make it absolutely clear now that we're not going to have these cars to be bought new after 2032, partly so that you are not only encouraging people by the encouragement that we already have, and perhaps it would be necessary to do more, but certainly what we already have, but you're also saying to people that if you buy an electric car, or if you don't buy an electric car, you'll be in a position in which the value of the car that you've bought will be significantly affected by the fact that year by year, we're going to have more and more electric cars. And the big problem too is if we don't do it as early as we are proposing, then we will be a dumping ground for other cars from other countries that have already made these steps. So that's why it's important to be ahead of the curve rather than behind it. And then as far as housing is concerned, I'm not in favour of government prescription as to whether houses should be built off-site or not off-site. What I am in favour are standards which are very clear and which people have to meet wherever they build those houses. And the way to do that is, first of all, to have a basic standard which is close to a kind of reformed passive house level. Secondly, you have to have enforcement. We really do have to get local authorities to see that when houses are built, they actually meet the standards. I don't believe that quite a lot of houses that are built today meet the standards of today, because the system of controlling them is so lax that very few houses are actually properly inspected when they are complete. So proper enforcement, generally a passive house standard, and then you allow people to build it in whatever way they find the best way to do it. But the problem is that we are short. If you build them in any other way than in a factory, we are very short of skilled labour to do that. And that's why upskilling is a really important part of what we should be doing, and is part of the way in which we create jobs of a sort which will be sustainable. I'm very conscious of the fact that the construction industry is way behind other industries in the degree in which they recognise the need for skilling. When I was the Secretary of State for the Environment, which is a long time ago now, but when I was ashamed to find that I presented the first certificates for a construction industry training system. That they hadn't had one of that sort before. And it does seem to me that that's a key part of what we're trying to do here.
Thanks, Lord Debe. That's really helpful. So, you know, on the fact that about the clean air zones, that enforcement's necessary. Obviously, we've got number plate recognition technology, which would take care of that. And then on the housing, again, you know, we did have the, you know, code of saleable homes, which never got implemented.
Yep.
And then then we had the zero homes, zero carbon homes program, which got implemented. We have to have a third go at this, which I know you do support. So that's great. I haven't noticed hands up or anything. Does anybody want to come in on this topic? I know I can see Andrew Stunnell, Baroness Young, Ferial, who's my colleague on the EAC, and Alan Brown. Do any of you want to come in at this stage before we bring in the people? Yeah, so Andrew, please go ahead.
Okay, first of all, can I just establish that you can hear me properly? I had a sound problem earlier on. Good. Well, first of all, I agree with so much of what Lord Debe has said. I just wondered if we could draw better or more parallels between the kind of intervention there is in the market for cars and the complete lack of intervention in the market for homes. If I want to buy an electric car, I can get a government subsidy. And indeed, there are all sorts of hidden benefits that come to me. If I buy a zero home, people want to charge me extra because the developer says it costs more, which probably isn't true. But shouldn't we, as well as doing all the very sensible things you've set out, be advocating that the regulatory system should be strengthened, as it has been for the automobile industry? And secondly, that there should be some kind of grant availability. If we look at retrofitting as one particular example, which you highlighted as being really suitable for employment reasons and poverty reasons and many other reasons, VAT is an obvious problem, and something that can be changed to change the whole climate in which people operate. I suppose I ought to declare a bit of a personal interest. I'm about to move into a not very well insulated home, and it's costing an arm and a leg to try and get things sorted out. So there are huge barriers, even for those who are keen to go ahead and have very sustainable homes. And there needs to be a mixture of regulatory stuff and also grant and other incentives.
Andrew, I would draw a distinction between those two things. I mean, first of all, there has got to be grants and incentives for people to be able to insulate homes which they already live in and which are already there. My own favourite of this is that it seems to me that we ought to have a system whereby if you sell your house, automatically you have to show that you've raised the standard of the house by at least one level, and that's really important, and that if you haven't done so, that part of the money is kept in escrow to enable the new purchaser to do that to the house itself. I think you could do that. I think there are things you might be able to do with stamp duty, but there are all sorts of things that we ought to do. It's not for me to be prescriptive as to what the government should do about it, except that it has to be about grants and help. As far as new houses are concerned, I'm not in favour of subsidy, because it'll go straight to the price of the land. And the fact of the matter is that if you set high standards, it's not going to increase the price of the house. That's what the house builders always say. And they've always told lies about it. It isn't true. Yeah. What happens is that if you have to build to a particular standard, the house builder knows precisely how much they can sell the house for, because that is the determinant, not the cost of building it, not the cost of anything. It's the determinant is what can I sell a house for? And that's fixed by the 9 companies that build 80% of our houses. So they do that. So if you make them build to a higher standard, what will happen will be is they will still want their profit margin, and what will happen will be that they will buy the land at a lower price. And as the difference between building land and agricultural land is so huge, it will not make a difference to the availability of the land. The reason they don't want to do it is that they've become land speculators, and they have large quantities of land which they've already paid for at a price which assumes that they're not going to have to build the sort of houses they're now, I believe, going to have to build. I'm afraid I'm not terribly miserable about that. They have got some of the best returns on capital they've ever had. They seem to, one company seemed to manage to even offer its chief executive, for not any good particular reason, something like £100 million, which was then very kindly reduced to something like £40 million. That could be much better used on making up for the past transgressions. So I wouldn't give them grants at all. I think that can be done by the market and regulation, good, tough, enforced regulation.
Thank you. I know we've had a vote in a House Law. I assume it's House Laws, otherwise I'm in a lot of trouble. I think Baroness Young has managed to vote whilst on the corner.
While you ask questions, I will just be voting too. I can do it.
Okay.
Yes, there's
maybe Andrew Studdle's voting. I don't know. Maybe he's voting as well. But I think Baroness Young has voted. So
yeah. Well, there is now a list. There is now a list of places I have voted from, which which I shall add the APPG to. Can I just pick up a couple of things Lord Debe said? One is the whole business of the way the house builders react. If you recall, we were well on the way to having the zero carbon home standard implemented in the middle of, I don't know, what was it, 2014, 15. And they'd kicked and screamed like Billy-O, the house builders, but they had eventually recognized that this was going to happen, and they had plans in place for building to those standards. And then George Osborne, of course, came in and put the kibosh on the whole thing. And that was a real missed opportunity. But it did show that, you know, given the strong signal, the house builders would actually find ways of cost effectively building to zero carbon standards. So I don't break my heart over the house builders much either. The other thing is, though I'm not totally sold on off-site construction, our select committee in the Lords on Science and Technology did a report on off-site construction and system building of houses. And I was rather taken with the quality that could be produced. And it is certainly a fast-track way to getting standards into new housing, as well as delivering all sorts of other benefits like health and safety and other cost reduction technologies. So I think we should keep the government's feet to the fire on this, because what they did was announced that in terms of government procurement, there would be 5 key departments who are the biggest capital project procurers would be asked to seriously examine how they could introduce off-site construction and require off-site construction in their procurement contracts. Well, I asked a parliamentary question about that about 2 days before lockdown, and the answer was that sod all had happened and there had been no monitoring of it since that requirement, it was called a challenge, went out, and the challenge has neither been met nor been monitored. So I think that there's plenty we could do just with pre-existing government commitments to make sure that we do build zero carbon homes for the future. The thing that came out of our study on from the Select Committee was there's got to be a huge retraining and reskilling effort within the construction industry for all sorts of purposes, not just climate change, but for off-site construction, for really revolution. I mean, we're still building homes the way the Romans did, for God's sake. You know, let's get real. We've got an opportunity to develop new technologies and to systematize and standardize housing construction without them being nasty little boxes that nobody wants to live in, and let's go for it.
Barbara, I think you're being too nice about the house builders. The thing that was really serious about getting rid of the zero carbon homes plan was that the companies which had had got ready to do these things, like Barrett's, for example, who had got ready to do it, they were then undercut by companies that had taken no part in preparing for it, dare I say like Persimmon, who had actually not prepared for it. And it seemed to me that it was a particularly damaging thing for the credibility of government, and indeed for the kind of decency of government, because what you did was to reward those who had not sought to do what they were supposed to do, having been given a very long warning, because after all, the zero house plans were put into operation by the previous Labour government. I mean, to be a bit frank, they were a very long time. It was given a very long time because I think ministers would realise they might not be around in order to be to have to carry it through. I'm always suspicious of governments of any kind which sets rather long time targets before they do anything. But the truth is, it was a scandal, and it made good people suffer and bad people benefit, and that is not the way you should run a government.
I agree, John, though it was your government what did it.
Well, if I may say so, I am an independent. I sit as a Conservative because that's what I've always been, but I vote as an independent, as you well know.
Clearing up that point. We've had David King join us now, who is also an independent, and I think, you know, you've got two hats you could potentially wear today, David, as the chair of Independent Station. This is about how we come out from COVID and to recover and a green recovery, and also all of your stellar work over the years on climate change now with the do you want to about what challenges are, how we can respond to them, and then we'll carry on with the Q&A.
I think that most of us are tending to underestimate the rate of recovery from COVID-19. We are seeing a totally new phenomenon worldwide, which is each country creating its own massive debt to cover the period of the pandemic, and this is very, very difficult to see how that will be managed. Are we all just going to announce a sudden debt relief process? The process isn't at all clear. But nevertheless, there's also the problem of how long it will take for us to come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Britain is in the worst place in Europe. I think everyone's aware of that we've got enough new cases each day today to cover more than the whole of the rest of Europe put together. So we've really not handled this well. But so as we recover, and I'm sure I'm coming into the discussion late, there is an opportunity to place an understanding around what we've learnt during this period. I'm here talking to you from Cambridge, and this is a wonderful example because we've all learnt the advantages of Zoom and Skype, etc. We can communicate with the whole world. I had one wonderful week when I spoke to the governor of California, the president of the Maldives, and I gave a speech in Delhi, all from my study here. Zero jet lag in that week, and it really pays through as a massive advantage. I just hope we don't ever feel we have to go back to that level of traveling. In other words, the situation before, if I wanted to see somebody like the governor of California, would have been, he would expect me to take the trouble to fly there. I hope that we don't get back to that sort of situation. So that means there will be less air travel. That does probably mean as well that air travel is going to go up in cost. And this gives an opportunity for the alternatives means of travel to get up there and meet the demand. I mean, as a matter of fact, all forms of travel ought to be in a transitional state as a result of our learning from this process. Now, of course, that doesn't apply to the vast majority of people who are in the production process and who have to go to work, and we all know what is involved in that. But nevertheless, if we focus on shifting into the future, let's pick up from what the former governor of the Bank of England was saying since 2015. Any investment in infrastructure needs to be fit for purpose 30 years from now. And 30 years from now is in the post-fossil fuel era. And we must make sure that therefore everything is vetted to see that it is not just green, but carbon dioxide free. We have to be in a deep and rapid emissions reduction scenario over the coming future. And my plan is, I'm afraid, we also have to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases we've also already put into the atmosphere. I can just illustrate that with one new fact. And perhaps you've seen this. In the north of Siberia, over the permafrost region, the temperature last year hit a record of 20 degrees centigrade, 20 degrees centigrade on the ice. And this year, 38 degrees centigrade. The Arctic region is heating up far more rapidly than the rest of the planet because the Arctic Sea has been exposed by the melting of the ice that was previously covering it, and blue sea soaks up sunshine and the white ice reflects it. So we're in a very deep problematic situation, and we need a real focus on managing this. If we look at the greening of the economy, which is, I think green recovery is a very good phrase. I hope it is widely accepted. If we look at that, then what we need to do is also examine how we can employ people. Now, of course, the energy sector has tended to be a relatively small employment sector, but the renewable energy sector tends to be a much larger employment sector. So actually, the offshore wind industry in particular has become a very large employer of people. Over 250,000 people are now employed in the the renewable energy sector. And it's also therefore important and incumbent on us to see that as we look at new technologies rolling out to replace the old ones, they are in that high employee category. Normally, new technologies require that situation. It takes a while before the automation steps in. So we've probably got about 20 years of a higher employment in those areas. Now, I have missed the whole of your discussion, and I feel I should stop because I'll be saying things, Alex, you've already been hearing. But I would be delighted to be working with you and help you in any way I can.
Thank you. That's a very generous offer, because obviously the Net Zero APPG trying to do all the things that you've just spoken about and outlined. And I don't think anything you said actually either conflicted or repeated anything Lord Debe said. So that was a very, very well judged intervention. I'll start off with a question, because you talked quite a lot about starting off with your meeting with Gavin Newsom in California from Cambridge about the aviation industry. So aviation emissions account for about 2.5% of the UK's emissions. Aviation shipping is a contentious issue, actually, when it comes to the government and the Climate Change Act and our carbon budgeting, and actually who's responsible for aviation emissions and all of those difficult issues, which actually I think the COP will need to resolve next year to move forward. But aviation looks like, if we look at the expansion plans for all our airports, won't be contributing 2.5%, but by 2030 something like 15% of carbon emissions. So actually it's a big challenge, and also in the jobs challenge, it's a big challenge, because not only is it about the airports and the airlines, but we have Airbus and Rolls-Royce and their whole supply chain, very heavily based in the UK, supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs. So what's the solution there? How do we deal with that? You know, the demand side is spoken about, but the supply side and the job side, how do we deal with all those people working those industries and those companies and the airport expansion plans?
Is the question to me?
Yes, because you were the one that raised the.
So I think I need to mention something called Mission Innovation, which was a program that was initiated by myself working with several members of the House of Lords, and I took it through when I was in the Foreign Office. And mission innovation is a reality. The idea was to get countries to join a program of work aimed at spending $30 billion a year of public money on research and development into all of the technologies we need in a post-fossil fuel world. Now, 2015, the first day of the COP meeting, we got all of the countries prepared to join, to stand under the banner Mission Innovation. There were 22 country heads under the banner and the president of the European Union, European Commission. And those together were promising $30 billion a year. This year, we're actually spending in that program $23 billion a year. It's the biggest collaborative program under the climate change agenda that has been achieved so far. Now, the idea, of course, is to bring the private sector in to take these new technologies into the marketplace. Bill Gates understood that. He's already put $1 billion into a company that is based in California, but is already funding the technologies that he thinks will be successful in the marketplace. He fully understood the objective of mission innovation. So I think the first thing is we need to keep an eye on what technologies are emerging. There's a British company that has on the cards, they are constructing an airship. You know, airships have been around a long time. This is a modern version of an airship, a beautiful design. It is capable of carrying 150 tons of cargo. So it's all aimed not at passengers, but at carrying freight. 150 tons of cargo with no fossil fuel usage whatsoever. Right? How does this work? It's lifted by releasing helium into air balloons. If you want to bring it down, you pump the helium back into a cylinder. The helium isn't lost. How do you fly? You filled it up with tomatoes in Spain. You want to fly to Britain, deliver to supermarket depots. It's got electric engines designed by Siemens, and the electricity is supplied by photovoltaics on the top of the vehicle. And it flies at 30,000 feet, very little air resistance, 340 kilometers an hour. It's not sluggish. Now, this is the modern version of the airship, and I can't see why it shouldn't carry people as well. This is the kind of breakthrough technology I'm talking about. And what it needs is nurturing. You know, when we look at the way that photovoltaics, offshore wind, and so on have become so competitive, it is because initially the government provided, in effect, feed-in tariffs or energy cost differences, etc., to encourage the development of these new technologies. In other words, I don't think government should stand by and hope these reach the marketplace. There needs to be always an incentive process, because as with the fossil fuel industry, the aircraft industry is the incumbent, it's mature. What these new technologies need the incentive to be able to compete with them. And once they're competitive, they're going to sell like hotcakes. So I think that's the way I would approach this. By the way, Alex, I think it needs a very clear-minded process. Right, so we need a strategy, a timeline. We haven't got a lot of time on our hands to deliver this, because as we come out of this crisis that we're in today, we want to be able to move smoothly forward without recovering by simply going back into the old mode.
That was very encouraging, David. Hopefully, Rishi Sunak has heard you and will be implementing those in the budget next week. If you could say it to the media, that would be great. If we can get a bit of a heads up, because people do listen to you more than maybe to myself or Ferrell Fleur, who are opposition MPs. So we had, before you came on, we had a question from Charles Malissa, and I think that probably was to Lord Debe. But Charles, if you want to ask it to both David and Lord Debe, that's fine. If we can bring Charles in, he's here actually. If you can ask your question, Charles. You've not got your video on, but I know you can speak to us.
Hello, Alex, and hello, Lord Debe and Sir David King. My question was with regards to the progress report. So first of all, congratulations to the CCC on putting that together. My question was with regards to the role of procurement. It's mentioned 22 times in the report as an essential kind of vehicle of change. And we've heard from the Prime Minister today how he's going to use the might of the public sector to deliver recovery. What do you think is holding back the public sector and government agencies from actually using procurement to its full effect?
Well, I think the thing that holds it back is that they have been always speaking with with forked tongues, because they've been saying, yeah, we're going to procure on the basis of these standards, making sure that we only procure from companies that meet these standards. But in the end, when it actually puts out the procurement requests, they've always, or almost always, chosen the cheapest, whether it's the best or not. And there's a prize example of that in my business, Sancroft. We have a thing called the Sancroft Tussle Index, which we create with a company called Tussle. And what they do is to provide a list of the 100 companies with the biggest contracts with government. And we apply to that a very simple process of seeing how those 100 companies meet just one government law, which is in fact the modern slavery law. And last year, 38% of the biggest government contractors broke the law, didn't actually obey the law. So it wasn't a question they didn't do it very well, or they hadn't very many, but 38%. Now, nobody who breaks the law in a public way, in that way, should in fact get a government contract at all. The first thing you have to do, surely, is to demand that companies reach the standards you have set. You then get bit further into it and you discover that a very large proportion of the others, although they obeyed the law, it was only just exactly the minimum they had to do. They were not doing on modern slavery what everybody should be doing. So they were not seeking it out. They were not doing their best to stop it. All they were doing was meeting the bare minimum. And again, that's something that government should not actually participate in, which they do if they put out contracts to such companies. Now, you apply that to the issues we're talking about, and you'll find that most people in the construction industry, for example, complain that if you try to meet the higher standards and it costs a bit more, the government will choose a builder that's not doing that. And I think we've really just got to recognize that the way you use your procurement facility is crucial to the future. And if Boris Johnson says that he's going to use the might of public procurement, then the first thing he's got to do is to make sure that we don't buy things from companies that do not meet the standards, even the minimum standards that we lay down. And we've got to improve those standards at the same time.
Thank you, Lord Debe. My colleague Ferial Clark from the Environmental Audit Committee also wants to ask, I think, going back to your comments regarding housing. So Ferial.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, everyone, for your amazing contributions of speeches today. My question was going to be around the news that came out this weekend, whereby the funding that the government have put aside, was it 9.2 billion to improve energy efficiency of homes. And there was news this weekend that Dominic Cummings is withholding that funding and may transfer it to other projects. So I just wanted to find out, how likely are the government to meet their emission reduction targets if they don't actually deliver the program of home installations and energy efficiency in our schools, hospitals and homes?
Well, I can't comment on Mr. Cummings. I don't think I would trust myself to do that. But what I can do is to say very simply, the Climate Change Committee has made it absolutely clear that there is no way that we can meet the statutory requirements of the 4th and 5th carbon budget leave alone net zero unless we have a major program of insulation in our housing. I have to add to that, because I care a great deal about this country, that we won't get the jobs either. I don't see another mechanism. These two things come together. I'm not speaking about them simply from my passion for fighting climate change. I'm saying that there is no way in which we can find so obvious a method of providing jobs all over the country, and also of making life tolerable for some of our poorest people. That it is not acceptable to try to beat climate change in a way which is not just. And that we have to say all the time. So there are three good reasons for doing it. We won't achieve our ends. It's the one way of making sure that you get jobs. And thirdly, it's the one way of giving real justice to the basis of what we do.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take Baroness Young, and we're going to lose David. I'm not sure whether he's going back to the Governor of California or elsewhere in about 5 or 6 minutes. I'll bring him into comments as well, and then we'll take another question. So, Baroness Young.
I really wanted to raise something that David King raised, and that's some of the other measures that need to be adopted pretty quickly for taking carbon out of the atmosphere that's currently there. You know, obviously I declare my interest as chairman of the Woodland Trust, but the whole woodland, peatland, green infrastructure agenda ought to be something that the Chancellor's got high up his list, because not only does it, you know, trees eat CO2 for breakfast without a doubt, but also it can help with the skills agenda. You know, we've got shed loads of kids out there who are not going to get jobs, and who have got a really strong commitment to the climate change agenda, and have really noticed that nature and biodiversity and open space is something that they value during lockdown. And that seems to me to be a perfect recipe for getting a whole load of skills and training offered to younger people in some of these reconstruction of our natural environment that are going to be really important for climate change as well. So I'm glad David King raised that as an issue that also needs to be resolved, as well as zero carbon issues running alongside it.
So David, can I add the C to that? So if you come back, but also maybe you want to comment around things like seagrass and kelp and things that can sequester carbon from the sea and stop ocean acidification, which is as big a threat in some ways as airborne emissions.
Thank you, Alex. I think I've got roughly 2 minutes, so I'll talk quickly. So, Baroness Young, thank you for your comment. I think I ought to just quickly tell you that here at the Centre for Climate Repair in Cambridge University, we do have a group who are very keen to work on the improvement of our woodlands and who will also be working on increasing the extent of our woodlands as one way of seeing that we capture more carbon dioxide. It has to be done, as I'm sure you know, extremely carefully. We may end up planting trees that actually are unfit for purpose in the given areas. So that is an area where we have a bunch of experts already working. The NERC, the research councils, are funding 5 greenhouse gas demonstrators around the country in our universities. And we have bid to be the hub that oversees the work of these 5 demonstrators. And what we want to do is oversee each of their abilities to manage the process without any negative outcomes and to manage it at scale. So we see ourselves as having a potentially big job to do in that area. I think, sorry, Alex, you raised another point, which was
about the contribution of ocean plants, seagrass, sea kelp.
Yeah. So the Earth's surface is 72% oceans, and if we can raise the level of kelp at the coastline areas in particular by simply upwelling nutrient material from the ocean floor to the surface, all you do is upwell the nutrient and the kelp just grows. This causes, of course, effectively ocean forests, which have a full life of their own. And then the second is to imitate a natural process. When the wind blows over the Sahara Desert, lifting up a dust storm, and then drops the dust storm when the wind dies down over the Atlantic into the ocean. It floats on the ocean due to the surface tension of the ocean and creates a green area of that whole area, and maybe 10,000 to 100,000 square kilometers at a time. That whole area will then end up with several billion fish within a few months. It becomes a living forest in a short period of time, taking up carbon dioxide, but also creating fish stocks. So these are the kind of things we want to look at. There's a lot of work that needs to be done before they can be rolled out to scale. At which point...
Maybe your airships can drop the sand on the oceans. Maybe
but
airships there.
but before Dave goes, I mean, there's one very simple thing that we could do, and that is to stop bottom trawling. Which at the moment is, of course, destroying the ability of the bottom of the ocean to maintain itself as a carbon sink. And we could do that, and we could make the Dogger Bank, for example, give a real contribution to climate change and the battle against climate change. And I'm afraid we have just got a fishing bill in front of Parliament, and there is no effort whatsoever to do those sort of things. And it took a revolt by quite a number of us to insist that into that bill, sustainability becomes the main purpose of the bill. And before you do anything, you've got to make sure that the sustainability is crucial. So there are things we can do without any of the new technology, just simply stop people destroying things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So these bills that we're facing in Parliament at the moment, you've just mentioned the fisheries bill, the agriculture bill, the environment bill, are all crucial. And I think you've got more power at your end of the building to affect it than ours, but we certainly are going to try to, particularly in Bill Committee, which are ongoing at the moment on some of these bills. So I've got a couple of people in the attendee section. No, Fleur wants this question. Yeah, come in, Fleur.
I'm really sorry to have been late, but thank you very much for having this meeting, and I'm definitely here to learn. Also, to add to your list of bills, the trade bill. So I was in the Bill Committee arguing for environmental standards that were all kicked out, but hopefully can be brought in by another place. I just wanted to follow up on the question of having more jobs. So more jobs in terms of insulation putting in, and the more jobs that Baroness Young talked about in woodland conservation and woodland work. Has there been work done, and I'm sure you can point me to where it is, about how we would provide the training for the jobs that need to be done? So would it need to be more funding for local colleges to be able to run the courses to enable, or how would the jobs that we envisage being necessary for carbon reduction be provided in terms of the skilling? And is that something we should be calling for first to enable the next step to happen?
The Department of Work and Pensions always tells me that they have a whole scheme going forward on this matter. I think we should be pushing for it. I do think that Britain has not a very good record under any government for the kind of technical and training which we're talking about. We've never really reached the standards we ought to. I read a very interesting debate in the House of Commons, the committee in the House of Commons, about how Germany was so much in advance of ourselves. It was only later that I saw that they were referring not to Germany but to Prussia, and the debate was from the 1870s or 1860s. I mean, the fact is we have a long history of not really being up on the front foot here, and we need to do much more about technical training and to make it much more attractive to people. I do think we are very odd. I mean, the Germans, if you say somebody's an engineer, that means he's somebody of, or she's somebody of real standing. Here, you refer to somebody who will put something into your television set as an engineer, as if anybody can be an engineer. We've really got to make these jobs really worthwhile and people respected for doing the job, for everything from the way that we write down plumbing and things that really matter, and yet we treat them as if they're kind of second-rate and unimportant, whereas if you go and read English at university, and I did do 2 years of that, so I can say that honestly, that somehow or other is very much superior. I don't believe a word of it. It'd be much more useful if I could do the plumbing, I have to say.
Thank you, Lord Debe. I've got David Cole next. Did you want to come in, David?
Yeah, thank you. I'll come in as a trained engineer who waiting for respect from society one day. I'd also just want to pick up on a minor point from the procurement piece. That was the discussion, which I thought was very interesting. And one of the things we've been looking at recently is you scale up electrification of vehicles globally to keep an eye on the supply chain there. There's a limited supply of materials, and there's already challenges in human costs and how that's produced globally. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be a big challenge for decarbonisation in transport, and something that Lord Deben's right to point out to keep an eye on and focus. My question, though, or open to debate, is we talked on this Net Zero Party Parliamentary Group about the importance of how integrated power, infrastructure and transport is. If you're going to increase one or the demands of one area, the other has to follow, and likewise. The lack of a delivery plan or a net zero delivery body, how important is that to attracting investment, creating the right platform for training and jobs, so that we can get confidence in the plan going forward?
Well, I'm always a bit concerned about suggesting that some institutional change will solve our problems. So I don't want to say that there's only one way of doing this, but it is interesting how, if you take offshore wind, we've had this wonderful revolution because the government was sensible enough, and we attacked George Osborne for one decision. The great decision he made was to allow 7.6 billion, I think it's right, 7.6 billion to be spent on creating the offshore wind industry. And down in history, no one has done that before. So it is worth saying that he did do that. But we have the most ludicrous sort of Heath Robinson mechanism for bringing offshore wind energy onshore. And it's all based upon some curious view about people having to compete one offshore wind array with another, instead of having a sensible system. And I declare an interest because my former constituency is absolutely up in arms, because all the way around they're going to have these transformers in little villages, because they've got to come on separately instead of having a single ring main, which any sensible person would do, and all of them contributing to it. That's just one example of how bad we have been at pulling all this together. Now, whether you need a net zero delivery body, or whether you actually provide a secretariat to the cabinet committee chaired by the Prime Minister, which should meet every month, and that's one of the things that we've said, is really a matter of discussion. What you do have to do is actually stop this mixture of wonderful results in some directions and totally laughable mechanisms by which we do other things.
Okay, so I've got a couple of other people on the panel, so I'm just going to see if they want to come in, and then otherwise I'll go to the broader attendees. So there's Alan Brown and Steve Hargreaves. Do either of you want to ask a question? Not seeing. I can see Steve. Steve does. Yeah, come in, Steve.
Yeah. Thanks, and a very, very interesting debate. The question I've got actually is around financing. Because what we've got is a very large capital program coming up, to a certain extent in power, but even more so in decarbonisation of heat and decarbonisation of transport. And we have this opportunity at the moment where the macroeconomic environment means there is very low cost money, but it may not make it to all of the people who need it, you know, particularly when you think of decarbonising heat. Everybody, if they've got to replace their gas boilers and all that sort of stuff, yeah. So is there a role that government ought to play in getting access to low cost finance in terms of, particularly in terms of heat?
Well, the biggest role the government should be playing is making it possible for ordinary people to find out what you have to do. I mean, I just think it's the most confusing situation, and I can say that honestly myself, because I want to take the opportunity of this summer of changing our heating system, and trying to get the proper advice, even if you are lucky enough, as I am, to know some of the people you can ask, is really complicated. And I do think that the first thing we've got to do is to make it easier for people who want to make these changes to get the right advice and to know that when they've made the changes, they're properly installed and they do what they promise they're going to do. Second thing is, I am a believer in incremental change, and I do think that we should move through a hybrid system, because there are many older houses which really are not suitable for installation of a pure, for example, air source pump. You need to have a hybrid system so that it's, for part of the time, they would use gas or either piped gas or as in living in the country in a tank, but it would be a small part of the time when, because you can't have the sort of underfloor heating and underfloor heating systems and such like you can in new houses, you need to have that mix. Now, we can only do that if we make it possible for that to happen. And the big possibility is not necessarily an increase in what the government spends, but it's a reform of the renewable heat incentive so that it encourages people and enables them to have these changes. And it also provides a mechanism whereby they know what is the best for them, and that they know that the people who are installing it know what to do. In the case of heat pumps, one of the problems of heat pumps is that they very often haven't worked even as well as they could, simply because they've been badly installed and the people who are supposed to install them have not been properly trained. So there's quite a bit for the government to do there, and that's what I'd like them to concentrate on.
Thank you. So next, got Ash Gupta, and I can see that he's in, so I'll bring you in now, Ash.
Thanks, Alex. This is for Lord Debe. It's a point about Norway. You're quite right, we have a different situation, but I'm working very closely with a company that's caused a lot of interest with our DNOs, two in particular. I'm based in Edinburgh, so I'm talking to the two DNOs north of the border. What's happening there, particularly in two cities, Oslo and Trondheim, we have in certain months over 70% of the new cars registered are EVs. And what happens when they all go home at night is that the substations start to fail because of the harmonics caused by this. So this is not happening here because we have very low penetration, but it's coming. So the DSO, head of DSO, one of the two DNOs and ourselves are talking regularly about how we can mitigate this. In other words, if we plan now, there's some 265,000 substations which need upgrading. This can't be done because the regulator doesn't allow the DNOs to do it in advance, but at least they'll be prepared. So what Norway can teach us is how to get our infrastructure ready for what's going to happen, because if it doesn't, the substations will fail. And the second point is really about zero carbon homes. I don't know if you're aware of the Carbon Free Group and what they're doing at the old site of the Corby Steelworks, but they're building 47 zero carbon homes, which are, Baroness Young, you'll like this, they're actually built in the northwest of England, in the Wirral, shipped down and assembled on site. And my first degree was in history and theory of architecture, the first person to graduate from the School of Built Environment in Edinburgh in that. It's been a long time coming. I graduated in '69. These 47 houses, they've broken ground now. But there's high tech built in so that the air is transferred in and out of the structures. And it uses recycled materials to create the fabric for the outer shell of the building. So that's probably worth Googling. It's called, if you just Google zero carbon housing at Corby, all of this data comes up in this PDFs. Now, if they can do it there, then the rest of the building industry can take a leaf out their book and do it.
Well, I mean, I entirely agree with that. And I think you put your finger on something we've got to get right as well. And that is the institutional barriers to doing the things that we need to do. You used the example of the regulator and whether people can do this in advance. I think that's true in the water industry. It's true in lots of other industries. We really ought to be willing to do these things in advance. So it's not just a question of getting ready. It's also a question of campaigning to make sure that the rules under which these regulators operate are fit for purpose as far as moving towards net zero. I would very much like the BEIS to have a version of the Better Regulation Committee, deregulation committee as it was before. I think what we need to have is a place where the public, anybody, could apply and say, this is stopping me or my company or that company doing what it ought to do because of this institutional, legal, whatever else it is that's getting in the way. And that it should have a statutory requirement to investigate those things and to have the powers to change them. We really need to have a get there attitude. And there isn't anywhere for the public to go. We all pick these things up, we complain about them, we pass them on, but there isn't somewhere where you can in a very direct way influence this by pointing out the difficulties. Very simple one. In Scotland, it's far too hard, you're speaking from Scotland, it's far too hard to install small hydro motors in rivers. The rules and regulations make it almost impossible, and yet there's quite a lot of energy that could be created that way, and people would be prepared to pay for it if the rules were changed. And I do think we have got to be very, very clear about that. There are very few advantages in leaving the European Union. Indeed, I find it very difficult to think of any of them, but one is that we might be able to change some of these rules ourselves rather more quickly, but we're not even taking that advantage.
Thank you. So I've next got Mark Jenkinson, who's also now in our panel section. So Mark, take it away.
Okay, thank you. I've got three short questions for me. First one was also, what was the government's response to the CCC's latest advice from last week, if any? I think you've partly maybe answered that. I was going to ask, well, if not Norway, which other countries should be using as a benchmark, if not Prussia? And also, to Alex, any initial feedback also from government with regards to the first wonderful sessions from the APPG?
The government won't give its official response until later. That's also statutorily when it does do that. It doesn't do it until, I mean, it has to do it before October, but it doesn't do it until it can look at what is a very, very considerably longer report than usual. I shall be looking very carefully at the Rishi Sunak's statement. What the Prime Minister has talked about today is largely a revamp of things that he's already said. What we're looking forward to is what the Chancellor says, and we shall be measuring what he says against the requirements that our reporters put forward. So that's the first response that we must expect. We had a good response to our letter to the Prime Minister, so I'm expecting to have a good response there, but we shall see, and if it isn't, we shall say so. we should also say thank you if they get it right, because I do think one of the things in politics that we don't do is to say thank you when people do finally do the right thing. I'm very keen on doing that. As far as the fundamentals are concerned, I do think it's true that there is a real, genuine desire to meet these requirements in all political parties. The trouble is that if you have a common desire, that sometimes turns into a degree of complacency. And the one thing we don't have time for is complacency. So we'll be pushing for speed. And I hope that the opposition will also take that view, that what we're pushing for is to get the government to do it, and do it quickly, and not sit there trying to better it, to improve it. I do think this is one area where the perfect is the enemy of the good, and we must get ahead with it.
Thank you. In terms of our work, we published our 10 recommendations last week from the series around tables, and I know this doesn't answer your question, but I know from our side that those recommendations have gone into the Green Recovery consultation proposals today and were discussed with Alan Whitehead, who's the Shadow Minister for Energy. In terms of the government, I don't think we've formally had anything back, and I think that it's probably a bit early, but I think that our plan is to invite a government minister, hopefully Alex Sharma, to come on and to discuss the recommendations with him and have a session like this and to get some response. Because we're an APPG, I don't expect the government to answer a formal response. Obviously, what I could do is I could get the 10 recommendations and transfer them into written questions, which we might well do if we're not successful in having a session like this with Alof or another minister, and then get some formal responses. But we're not, I think because it's so early in the cycle, I suppose, we haven't had anything yet, but certainly, you know, hopefully we'll have a session soon with a government minister, Mark, and you can ask the question direct at that point. We certainly will be wanting to do that. So I've got 3 more from the audience. I'm going to come back round to the panel, and I'll probably have to go around that stage because I'm not in the house, as you probably can tell. I need to go in, otherwise I'll miss my vote. So I think we're taking Howard next. So Howard, you ask your question.
Hi, just coming back to the role of refurbishment of housing. I won't go my background. I've been involved in this game for far too long, but I think there's quite a lot of good things happening with what Lord Debe said about the advice, and I'm working with the Energy Systems Catapult, looking at getting a new type of job called the Energy Advisor, looking forward an Energy Advisor Academy idea. I think I recommend that perhaps in a future committee meeting, APG, that would be something useful to discuss. And I said that's potentially getting 50,000 people trained around the country to become energy advisors. And just to give one example, I've been asked in where I live in Watford to give advice to a number of householders who have money to spend, but absolutely no idea on how to spend their money. Oh. And I think I was brought round to say, oh, a bit like you, Lord Debe, I've heard heat pumps are good. Now, my organisation covers heat pumps, so I was keen not to sort of, however, in going round to their house, they found out that they could spend at least £10,000 in their house, making it rather more energy efficient. There was a rather large hole in their roof above their boiler, which may probably save them about £1,000 a year. So there was a big need for that sort of thing. But also, there's an organisation that I've been involved in on the board of called Trustmark, that is taking a lot of government advice and government roles in bringing forward a new digital way of helping consumers take forward refurbishment of their houses. And this is about a national database of all the work done. And once that national database is there, is to help consumers understand much more what can be done. And also, there's a great interest from the private finance industry because they need certainty. They need to understand that if they put their money into investment, they're going to get a decent return. And they're not going to have the situation in the past under the Green Deal of a few years ago, where basically there was no trust, the cost went up, and it didn't really work. So what I'm saying, I think that there are a number of things available out there, and the problem is bringing it together to make it work. And certainly I could offer on both those organisations, if Alex, you wanted a presentation or an input in a future meeting about how this new concept would work, we'd be very willing to put that together.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that, or do you shall I move on to the next contribution?
That's very sensible, so do move on.
Great. That's what we want, things that are just accepted by the chair of the Committee on Climate Change. So Miles Allen next. So Miles, do you want to make your contribution?
Sure. No, it's just a question really for the whole panel, but I'd be interested in Lord Deben's thoughts. A very clear and something which wouldn't cost anything would be to make recovery assistance, post-COVID recovery assistance, conditional on companies, recipients producing clear plans for how they're going to achieve net zero emissions, both for their supply chains, their activities, and the products they sell by or before 2050. I'm guessing there must be quite a lot of, chief executives sitting at home at the moment with time on their hands because their diary managers are on furlough. So this might be a good opportunity to give them some encouragement to start coming up and publishing their net zero plans. So I'm just wondering what the panel thinks, indeed what the Climate Change Committee would think about making that an explicit requirement for receiving post-COVID assistance.
Well, we have done that in the Climate Change Committee. We have said that there should be no assistance given except in circumstances where there's a clear route to improve towards net zero. And that's been emphasized today. I don't know whether you've read the reports just come out by EasyJet saying that it's going to make redundant a large number of pilots, and that it's going to close 2 or 3 of its airport operations. Now, that's very sad for the people whose jobs are involved. The thing that really was notable was that in the reports there was no consideration or concern about saying, well, those jobs need to be replaced in areas which are not going to be so damaging to the climate. In other words, we haven't yet got the story over that what we need to do is not just to bemoan the loss of jobs, but we need nor to shore people up in those circumstances, but to move very smartly to providing new jobs. And part of what the requirements should be to receive government help would be the production of new jobs in sustainable form, which will be there to do their part in getting the whole infrastructure and society ready for net zero.
Thank you. And then I think we've got Jake Sumner, and then we're going to come back to the panel. So Jake.
Thank you for that. Jake Sumner from Phil Consulting and CERA. We know we've got a decade to act, but we need action now in that decade. And so what should be sort of taken, what clear action should be taken over the next year, and how do we get clarity of targets? So the government's Transport Decarbonisation Plan consultation sets out good aims. The numbers in that document are based on the Clean Growth Strategy, not the stronger Committee on Climate Change targets. And should we not assess all expenditure through a carbon lens? And this is reported this year. And just, I guess, on Lord Deben's point on the jobs, is there not a basis then for a more active use of the industrial strategy to have sectors perhaps even co-bidding with trade unions and skills institutions to retrain and train workers that are needed. Retrofitting has been mentioned. There's a lot of jobs needed in that. So a much more coordinated approach.
I can only say yes. All that is right. That's exactly what we should be doing.
That's great. We're all on the same wavelength. It's really good. I'm going to.
Could I comment on that? Because we did in the select.
Then I'll hand over to Jill.
In the select committee on science and technology, we looked at the industrial challenge and the strategies to deliver that, and the grand challenges, and they're incredibly siloed. There's very little read across between them, and that's what's missing is a sort of overarching vision for what it is we're trying to achieve, that could then be adopted by a range of government departments and initiatives already underway from government. But at the moment, everything's tremendously siloed. I'm kind of hoping, I'm hanging my hat on hope that the Chancellor is going to drive a kind of overarching visionary thing from the Treasury, and this will be revealed, no doubt, very shortly.
Thank you. I'm gonna hand over to Jill because I need to go into the Palace of Westminster now. But I noticed that Andrew Stunnell was indicating. But I'll hand over to you, Jill, and I might see you again at the end if I get there in time. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Alex. Thanks very much. Yes. So, Andrew, if you'd like to come in, that would be great.
Well, first of all, I'm always in favour of an overarching strategy, but I'm also very suspicious of them because we've got a strategy defines your response, which isn't necessarily a good one. I mean, Lord Debe mentioned the difficulty with the Modern Slavery Act implementation. I'm sure all those 38 companies that failed have got a strategy, but they're just not implementing it. So I'm always interested in what's the first few practical steps that need to be taken. I want to pick up, I think, I'm not sure which of the contributors made this point about the appointment of energy advisors. Up to 50,000, I think it was the figure done. I asked a question about how many are there at the moment. This is in response to something called PAS 2030, which is 35, which is coming into force in April next year, officially at least. And everybody will need one to do a proper retrofit job. Well, the answer is 238. So we're a long way away from having 50,000 energy advisors at the moment. The good news is there's another 750 in training. But that's, you know, and people tend to talk about these numbers without thinking, how do we do 1 million homes a year retrofitting for the next 20 years? Because that's what we need to do in order to get the retrofit homes to the homes that we've got now up to the right standard. And you can't do that by 230 energy advisors. I can tell you there aren't any in Stockport because that's where I live, and I can't find one to give me any advice for my upgrade.
Okay, Lord Debe, do you want to come back on that?
No, I just agree with Andrew. I mean, I think that I do think that we take for granted the fact that people can find their way around these very complex matters. We're all peculiar because we're all very interested in it. Most people are passingly interested in it. And there comes the moment in their life where they have to be interested in it because the boiler blows up, or they fear that it will blow up, or they know that it's coming to the end of its life. And you've got to provide people with help at that point if they are going to do the best for themselves and for the climate. If you don't provide the help in one way or another, then we are not going to solve these problems. So I so much agree with Andrew.
Right. It's great to be in violent agreement, but it's quite clear we need to accelerate and prioritize pretty quickly. So I'm going to bring in Jim Coleman from WSP because he's been waiting patiently. And I think also if we can line up Charles Perry as well. And I also want to make sure that David Cole and I can't find you now, Steve Hargraves, if you're still there, are ready to jump in along with Karen to comment as well, to open up the debate a bit. But there's various other people waiting in the wing. So I'll call on Jim Coleman first and then Charles Perry. Okay, Jim.
Thank you, Jill. I just want to go back to the part of the discussion that's been about skills and employment, because I think skills development is absolutely fundamental to A, achieving net zero, and B, doing it in a way that generates a substantial economic impact and economic gain. And I think there's several challenges there. One is that we're talking about sectors which are around construction, engineering, technology. These are sectors which for many, many years have already had skills gaps, skills shortages. The skills are becoming more important in order to deliver net zero. So even overcoming the existing and historic skills gaps is going to be a big exercise. And we'll need a very comprehensive strategy, in particular to ensure that the positive impact goes across the country, that it spreads across the country. I think also, if you look at who is going to get these new jobs, I think history shows that the people who get jobs in new sectors with better quality jobs, they're people already in employment, already reasonably well skilled, already on maybe average or above average incomes. If we're going to reach out to other parts of society and really address leveling up, it means people who are unemployed, people who are economically inactive, people who are low paid getting into these new sectors. Again, that needs a big effort. And I think final point is the skills development and the job creation possibilities, they need to be gender neutral. In fact, personal characteristic neutral. Again, these are sectors which have tended historically to be dominated by men. And that cannot be the case going forward if we are going to have the positive impact that we need to have through this agenda. So it's quite a long-winded point. I'll stop there.
No, very good point. Andrew, did you want to say something, or was that just nodding?
Well, I very strongly agree with that. The construction sector at the moment has 9% of women. It's also got underrepresentation of BAME residents in the UK. So it's very, very undiverse, which is slightly paradoxical, but that is the truth. So yes, absolutely. The kind of things we're talking about now have got to be gender neutral, and the skills training, there's a desperate shortage, made worse, of course, by EU workers returning home from the construction sector. Yeah, there's a big problem.
Yeah, I think it's a recurring theme, isn't it? The skills shortage in net zero, at the same time as we're heading towards a lot of unemployment. So that whole shift needs to be addressed by government, doesn't it? So anyway, I'll just quickly bring in Charles and then perhaps go back to Lord Debe and David Cole. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much, Jill. Hello all, and well done to the Net Zero APPG for an excellent discussion. Question to John, going back to aviation and his point about offshore wind. So given offshore wind, thanks to the contracts for difference, we've got the economics of that. And given this is the economic challenge, the economics of that right down from, I think it was £160 per megawatt hour, right down where it's now, it's very affordable. With aviation, the alternative is sustainable aviation fuels, as you know, which is 2 to 5 times a premium. I'm just wondering, John, whether you think we could use the same approach of CFDs with the government being a key off-taker to drive down the costs of SAF in the same way as we became a global leader on offshore wind.
Well, I'm not sufficiently expert to know whether one could do that. The problem at the moment is that the aviation industry has been promising the most wonderful developments in this area for some time. And it's quite difficult to see that they really are there at the moment. So I'm not quite sure what we would be trying to encourage. But you are perfectly right that until we have a sustainable fuel for aviation, we are in real difficulties. But of course, the issue for the aviation industry is that what COVID has done is to hasten on the very things which undermine their business proposition. If people decide that 3 out of 4 journeys by air for business are not necessary, and increasingly that is what they are deciding, financial directors are not going to give permission for money to be spent in that direction, particularly when people will be watching the pennies very considerably because of the state of the economy. And so the business travel, which has really paid for the aviation industry, apart from the low-cost airlines, that business travel will be very, very severely affected. I don't know a single company that's expecting to have the same travel bills in a year's time. They are expecting not to travel anything like as much. And that's because we have been forced to use mechanisms to talk to each other, which we found work pretty well, except as I say today, when my camera, for some reason or other, doesn't work on this, but normally it does. So I just think that the problem for the aviation industry is that at the moment it's whistling in the dark. I've just seen the report from the chairman, chief executive of EasyJet, and I rather like EasyJet, but there we are. The chief executive has said it'll be 2023 before we get back to 2019 levels of business. I really don't think he's right. I don't think that is what's going to happen. I think it's going to take it's a very different route that we're going to have. And so I think the aviation industry has really got to be much more radical in the way in which it thinks about the future, because both its low cost and its normal, if you like to call it that, aviation solution has actually been very severely damaged by the changes which COVID have forced upon us.
Yeah, I think you might be right. Again, I think you might be right there, Lord Debe. Can I bring in David and then Steve Hargreaves from EDF? David first.
Yeah, I just want to come back to the skills question because I think it's a really interesting one. We take a fairly simple view of it, which is we get the projects going. As a big engineering company, we will train and develop the staff those projects require. Over the past few years, we've got over 600 people working on Hinkley Point C, for example, today, as a key engineering project in the UK to produce low carbon electricity. And then if you tie this in to the urgency of getting to net zero by 2050, i.e. we've got 11,000 days or less to get there, and quite a lot of the infrastructure we have today needs to be replaced, and we need to have potentially a larger system than we have already, even by the CCC further ambition scenario, which is a doubling of terawatt hours required per year, for example, in the electricity sector. We need to get these projects going now. The best way to create jobs is to get the projects going and getting them being designed and built and using UK skills and technology to do it. And that's across many, you need all sectors to get to net zero. It's not being preferential over one over the other.
Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, funnily enough, I was going to say almost exactly the same thing. You know, we've talked a lot about the really interesting bits of housing and yeah, greenhouse gas removals, but actually there's still a lot left to do with power. And you know, we probably need 6 times the offshore capacity that we've got today. We need 3 times the onshore capacity. We need new CCS projects, and we need 4 or 5 follow-on nuclear projects. And David's absolutely right. You know, the impact of these projects is enormous. You know, in Hinkley, we've David talked about his people working there, but we've got 11,000 companies in the southwest that we've spent some money with. You know, 1.7 billion in the southwest already. You know, on the project, and we get similar effects on. We've got a big offshore wind project up in Scotland. We get similar effects, and again, there is nothing. You know, we've got programs to get women into engineering, and we've got programs to get unemployed people into jobs. You know, there are jobs like in driving the buses and security. That they're not all high-end engineering jobs. There's all types of jobs associated with these things, and I think there's an awful lot that can happen by cracking on.
Absolutely. Now, on the chat, there's Tassos, if you're still there, and Hugh Lloyd. I'd kind of like to bring you in on the question. Yes, Tassos, you're there, so we'll go straight to you. And also, we had a question from Charlotte from the British Retail Consortium, so I'd quite like to bring you in as well. Those would be my next three. So we've got Tassos, Hugh, and then Charlotte, and then we'll probably come back and have a bit of a roundup with everybody. Okay.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the very interesting discussions. Thank you, Jill. So my question is more around how we can verify and ensure that the quality that we promise and design on paper is actually delivered and monitored afterwards a project has been completed. Because when I was involved with the Zero Carbon Hub, what we noticed was that while carbon is the common metric for assessing the impact on climate change, what is equally important is energy efficiency and energy demand in terms of how much we actually consume. And to date, we haven't seen a way of actually verifying that these savings are correct. And I'm not going to go into the detail of marginal factors for the electricity, but it's a whole discussion that needs to be made on how we ensure that we deliver on the savings that we foresee and design, and for the user to actually, alleviate fuel and produce additional social value. This is the question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question, and I think Hugh, it's sort of related. I think. Are you there?
Yes, Jill.
Great.
Thank you. I guess there's a lot of observations that have already been made by a variety of the panel members that we'd all have to agree with. The urgency of the challenge and the opportunities means we need to crack on in a variety of ways. So rather than perhaps sort of draw out too much of that, just to offer an opportunity, the Active Building Centre is one of those places the government is already investing in. It's working to show how you can integrate energy capture, energy storage, energy control, and EVs on buildings, be they homes, schools, hospitals, dare I say, given the announcements today. So in a way, it's just an offer to make sure that all the panel members have an opportunity to see what that technology means and what it looks like even in these times of lockdown. Last week, we had an opportunity to do a virtual tour with the Energy Minister. So perhaps I can send you a link to some of those things, Jill, and people can explore what that potential is. We think the opportunity is perhaps both in the urgency question, because clearly you can build homes everywhere and deploy technologies, much of which is either invented in Britain or made in Britain. That sort of leveling up opportunity. But also, if you get that integration right, some of the demands that people might expect to come from the energy system, the transfer from vehicle fuels, petrol and diesel to electricity, might not be anything like as large as being imagined. Our office building powers 3 EVs and still contributes to electricity demand to the grid, not from the grid. It's not connected to the gas system. So there are different ways of unpicking this. And the more we see the different technologies, the better. So there's an open invitation, and I'll show people the tour if they're interested. Thank you.
Are there any comments there from Lord Debe or any of the other parliamentarians or on the line? I think we've lost Lord Debe now.
Could I just comment on this business of how do we measure and keep a track of whether commitments are being undertaken? I've kind of lost track of what's happened about the net zero investment policy and the whole net zero test idea, because it does seem to me that actually things that are either supported by government, funded by government, or procured by government constitute a very, very large proportion of economic activity in this country, a substantial proportion of it. And that, the Treasury always has been slightly more on the ball in terms of monitoring the way in which money is spent. And if we did have a net zero test for any investment that involved, for any public investment, with a proper set of monitoring and assessment processes attached to it, so that people did begin to believe that that process had teeth, and that if they didn't fulfill the requirements that they'd agreed to, that there would be some retribution, some clawback, some whatever. And I think that that's something I think we should really be pressing for.
Yeah, I think apparently I've lost the British Retail Consortium, but can I bring in, really just to bring sort of a bit of a roundup comment around, I think, priority projects that we as a group might be pushing more. I think there might be quite a few, but I think one thing that's quite clear in terms of the roadmap and the work streams that we've got going via the all-party parliamentary group, that whole point around skills, employment and the green recovery is, I think, work stream 3. So we're going to get cracking on that. But I just think if I just wanted to sort of pull out anybody who wants to now give a final few words, and I'll go to you, Lord Debe, first, just to, I think, you know, you're quite clear on what you want to do, but just think of, I mean, if you had an opportunity to sort of say to government, there's one thing you really need to do, you know, what would that be? I think I know the answer, but over to you.
Well, it has to be, it has to be energy efficiency, because that is the necessary matter. And I don't care whether people think it's not very sexy or it doesn't sound very new. One of the reasons it doesn't sound very new is because we haven't done it. All we've done is talked about it, and it is manifestly better not to waste energy than to try to find other ways of generating energy. I mean, just a very, very simple concept. So I put energy efficiency absolutely at the top, not only because of its inherent necessity, but because it is geographically fair. It's something you can do everywhere in Britain. And thirdly, because you can do it for very large numbers of people who need it individually and personally, because of the fact that they are in cold homes which they cannot afford to heat. I do not think of anything else which has all those advantages and fights climate change and provides jobs all at the same time. And if it is true that certain people advising government don't understand that, it seems to me that it is a comment on their understanding rather than a comment on the importance of energy efficiency. And with that, before I'm tempted to say more, I think I have to say goodbye in any case, because I have another meeting to go to. So thank you all very much indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very, very
Thank
much for
you
your
very
time.
much.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to bring in Miles Allen from the University of Oxford now for priorities and for the economy and getting things moving.
Yes, I mean, I actually just put my hand up because I just wanted to respond to Baroness Young's point about the net zero investment question. I think, you know, Lord Debe did say that the CCC report had sort of emphasised the importance of companies producing plans going forward, but I think the financial community, I think the answer to your question is the financial community have done what it does best in this sort of situation, which is slightly to muddy the waters. And I think we could actually really help by reminding people that we're asking a very, very simple question. What does your business look like in a net zero world of 2050, and how are you going to get there? And I think if we got more answers from the CEO level, from companies to that question, I think it would be very helpful, particularly if those answers were published and the public could talk about them. So again, I think keeping that conversation simple is what is going to be the challenge, but it is actually a pretty, for most companies, it's a pretty simple question. They just haven't answered it yet.
Lord Stunnell, I think I know your priority would be.
Well, I absolutely agree with John and what he's had to say about retrofitting and energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is absolutely crucial, and the the energy producers have just been talking in the last few minutes here about doubling or tripling the amount of energy we're going to need in order to have a zero carbon economy in 2050. Well, actually, what would be much more sensible is halving the amount of consumption, which is absolutely achievable. And one of the biggest contributors to that is the construction sector. Another big one is the transport sector. And so we ought to be focusing on that as the number one thing to get sorted out. To do that, we certainly need an enhanced skills base. The good news is that the retro market needs middle-level skills and low-level skills. It doesn't need extremely high-tech skills. We've got time to catch up with the skills agenda. In the meantime, we mustn't let that slip. But I just come back to my point. If we want to have all our housing stock on the best energy efficiency possible by 2050, we've got 20 million homes which are still going to be there in 2050, which we've got now. So let's do 1 million a year and see where we've got to by 2040. There'll still probably be a few to finish off. But how on earth is a program of 1 million homes a year going to be built up over what timescale and with what kind of infrastructure? We've really got to get driving on this if we want to see the outcomes that we believe are absolutely essential.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I'm going to bring in David, Steve, and then Karen for final thoughts and wind up.
I do want to pick up on this energy efficiency approach. I think if you look at the further ambition scenario proposed by the CCC, that already has aggressive energy efficiency in it. You still need to increase the size of the system with that in mind too. And the truth is, we do not have the luxury of picking any one of these over infrastructure, be that energy efficiency, transportation decarbonisation, and decarbonisation of our power system. You have to do it all, and you have to do it at pace once you start to look at the numbers. We'll release a paper soon on build rate that shows on gigawatts per year to get to the kind of system we need to power low carbon heating, low carbon transport. We're currently at 40% of the rates we need to be. So I just think you got to look at the whole system, and you need a delivery plan for the near term. Otherwise, how are you going to know what jobs you want, what things to build, how to build them, and to where? The whole system, to come to Baroness Young's point, is linked up. You need to break down barriers and silos, because how much you do in one sector impacts what you do in another.
Yeah, that's good. Steve Hargreaves.
Yeah, thank you. At risk of repeating myself, the power sector, we need to crack on. It can address not only power, but home heat, industry, and surface transport. So 4/5 of our 500 million tons of emissions. So rather than worrying too much about the precise mix at this stage, let's crack on with offshore, onshore, solar, CCS, BECCS, nuclear, and then we can see where we are in a decade.
Very good. Okay, and Karen, final input from the lovely Karen.
It was great conversation today. Good to hear that energy efficiency and transport are finally bubbling to the top. A lot of this is based on behavior change. We didn't get enough of a chance to talk about that. We know the Climate Change Committee is recommending behavior change as a top priority, and that involves regulation as well as that incentives from government. I also wonder a little bit about the finance piece. We've been talking about a lot of infrastructure projects, and what are we going to do to tackle that, get the finance, get the investment into these projects? How is it regulation, which some of the financial industries themselves have really been clamoring for recently? We're worried about this stranded assets, about the reality of these companies' balance sheets, about what their forward planning is and how they are going to move into a net zero production for their services. So I think that we want to make sure that we aren't losing the perspective here on what we need to do, what's required. It'd be interesting to hear what other people are thinking about this on regulation for the finance industry and what we can do to bolster some of that behavior change.
That's excellent. So it's 2 minutes. So I think unless anybody wants to come back on any of the points, I think we've had an excellent session. It's great to have David King and Lord Debe on the call. Really fantastic. And if not worrying, in terms of how far behind the UK is and the challenge ahead. However, there is a huge opportunity to really, rethink where we are and to accelerate. So I think through the work of the group and getting that cross-party voice and consensus together, we are pulling this all together in terms of recommendations. And so we're very keen to have today's session on the heels of the Climate Change Committee's report last week. But I just have to thank everybody for joining us today. I think we had at one point over 130 people on the call, which is, in my vast experience of chairing all party parliamentary groups, is a bit of a record. So it's great to have so many parliamentarians. Thanks one and all for your contributions. I think we've had an excellent debate, and we will be able to watch yourselves on the recording on the website at some point as well. So thank you very much indeed, and have a good afternoon. Okay, thanks very much.